Hey guys, and welcome to episode 9 of Portraits of Greatness. I'm here with my co-host Rashid, as always, and we're going to talk about Oliver Cromwell and Carlyle's conception of hero as king for the first time. So we're actually going to skip his fifth lecture, which is on heroes, man of letters, and come back to it later, because we want to go have two kings as separate episodes, one being Cromwell, one being Napoleon, as sort of resolutions to their prefactors of other hero worships. So Cromwell, we're going to use as a foil, as a resolution to what we discussed last week with Luther. And then Napoleon, we're going to use as a foil to Carlyle's fifth lecture series, which is on man of letters. So the
Yeah,
paper
and
age of Voltaire and all that.
it'll
We're going to talk
also
about.
help us with pairing it with Emerson because, as you know, Napoleon sort of starts right at the end of the Cromwell essay, so it's mostly about Cromwell, whereas Emerson is mostly just focusing on Napoleon. So it would have like if we were to do it with Emerson, it would have these incongruous elements where we would have to jump from Cromwell to Napoleon all the time. Whereas if we do it together at the end, we will just have the context of Carlyle with the full essay of Emerson. So I think that it makes a good pairing overall.
Yeah.
So we're gonna. What was it you were saying?
Yeah, well, just this idea of Cromwell being the one that seems to obsess Carlyle more, or at least the one he wants to bookend his lecture series on. And I went into, sorry, I've got Siri popping up on my computer. I went into Carlyle got a compendium of Cromwell's letters and speeches, and he wrote a long introduction to it in which he fleshed out a bit more of what he thought about Cromwell. So I went into that, and I wanted to get the sense of why was he so obsessed with Cromwell? Because during the angry 40s, the hungry 1840s in England, and this resolution of how do we resolve the Poor Laws Act, how do we resolve the Corn Laws Act, Carlyle is always obsessed with this idea that a Cromwell equivalent will emerge. It'll take a hero as king figure to emerge to resolve this. That was what he genuinely thought. Similar to how Cromwell emerges to resolve the tensions between the parliamentarians and the royalists in England. Now you can say he doesn't resolve it as a mediator, right? He resolves it as, again, we talked about Luther, firebrand, right? It's not the Erasmian solution; it's the Lutherian solution, but it's from a sort of military commander who can then bring that militarism back into the body politic itself once the wars are over. So in order to lead into how Cromwell gets this, there's this timeline in the introduction to Carlyle's introduction to Cromwell's letters and speeches, and it fleshes out where Carlyle sees Cromwell coming from, because Cromwell has very humble beginnings, right? And I think he talks about this in his sixth lecture. He's basically like, he's from Huntingdon, which is just south of Lincolnshire, a very rural area of England, right near the Fens, which back then was largely unclaimed wash territory, right? It was this dirty end to a river, so marshland. And he's there, like right at the edge of England, almost staring into the North Sea past this messy marshland. So how does this obscure figure come in to central London in this absolute time of turmoil and end up being effectively, he's offered a crown late in life?
Yeah.
It's just, I think that's part of what so obsessed Carlyle. And so he traces out these events which try and help us understand how that happened. So there's this growth of Puritanism in England, and we alluded to this with Knox's Presbyterianism in the last episode, that when James becomes king in around 1601, 1603, in 1603, there is this millenary petition by Puritans who basically believe they can, under this new king, get a new Protestant style form of worship going in England than what had been the Elizabethan settlement. So there's a chance of new openings and new beginnings. And at this time, Cromwell is about 4 years old. So I think he's born in 1599. So he doesn't have any memories of the Elizabethan age. And so it's this whole idea of like knowing God and understanding what God is. and how do we have these proper forms of worship is impressed upon Carlyle at a young age. And Carlyle seems to say in these times between 1603 and like 1618, when he enrolls in the College of Sydney Sussex College in 1616, his house is filled with people talking about these positions, about what should the church do and all this. And it's very difficult to find the date at which he becomes a sort of devout Protestant, but Carlyle pinpoints it at about 1623, by which time he's already married and he's seen Walter Raleigh executed, which is, again, Walter Raleigh gets executed because basically James starts having an alliance with the Spanish, and the Spanish are arch Catholics. So you see Cromwell looking at this being, he's handing over English sovereignty as well from Cromwell's perspective when he's couching these alliances, and the whole Protestant position in Europe is under threat because the 30 Years' War kicks off and England's not seen to be doing enough to protect Protestant states such as the Palatinate, which gets invaded, and the Protestant ruler of the Palatinate gets kicked out, and I think he eventually dies in 1632. And again, the king is seen to be doing nothing on all of this. All of this milieu is springing up in Cromwell's like. So again, this linking of the Puritan ideal with English sovereignty is spinning around in Cromwell's head. And Carlyle believes this, right? He believes that Cromwell is a figure that is going to look for divine truth and providence with a zeal like what we had with Muhammad and all. And in the speeches that Carlyle collects, you see this in Cromwell, that he's quoting the Bible all the time. So for him it is providential. His whole mission is providential. And I'm just fleshing out like why Carlyle believes it to be so, and why is Cromwell this figure that emerges. Like, why should he care? Why did he not just want to tend his farm? Why did he not just want to? He goes to Parliament, possibly under patronage of some of these guys, some of the more Puritans, to speak for them in 1628 and 1629. Since 1629, Parliament gets closed down by Charles II, who's been king for about 4 years at this point. And then there's no Parliament for 11 years until the Long Parliament of 1640. And so at that point, he's seen all of the Protestant retreat, or what he deems to be a Protestant retreat from Europe, and a king who's doing nothing. And now there's a king who's not letting Parliament in. So there's parliamentary grievances of, you won't let us sit and debate by normal parliamentarians. But for Cromwell, this is twinned with the zeal, the devoutness. And I think Carlyle is obsessed with that devoutness. He would not be obsessed with a parliamentarian who didn't like Charles just because he shut down Parliament and just because the formulas didn't work. There has to be this unwavering
faith
eye at what needs to be done, and absolutely no moral qualms. You have complete conviction. And it's not just because of this formula; it's because comes from providence. So I did think when I was reading that there is this trace back to Muhammad, that Carlyle is obsessed with the zeal. He's not obsessed with formulas, and he goes on to state this in the start of the 6th lecture. I don't know what you thought about this, where he says about the man who believes in formulas is basically someone who he believes in a semblance. He's not believing in the true reality of things. If you remember those lines, that there's the semblance, and sometimes the forms can even get put on top of these semblances, but they're brittle forms that will cave in. And so any parliamentarian that was looking to be against the king simply on the means of, I want my representation, and without any of the other zeal, who thought they could come up with this perfect parliamentarian formula, is not something that's going to interest Carlyle. And so he says, well, of course, it's not one of those figures that during the grips and dirt of the English Civil War comes to the fore to seal the new protectorate or seal the new Commonwealth as it becomes before then. It has to be a figure like Cromwell, who has the religious devoutness.
I'm not sure if this is a quote from Cromwell or is something that Carlyle is sort of emphasizing, he would say. But a quote from this is, take your constitutional formulas in your hand and I my informal struggles and realities. So there's a constant, like you said, he doesn't view formulas. But what I got from that was that Carlyle doesn't believe in sort of predisposed paths, in a sense, because he says that most people's way of viewing Cromwell is that Cromwell, when he was still a farmer, had already had these ideas of getting into power, uh, bringing the parliament down, sort of taking his power to himself and becoming king and dictator, and like people view him like some sort
Yeah,
of a Batman villain without.
The people who view that there was this portrayal of him, especially by parliamentarians who felt he betrayed them, I think, such as Ludlow, that when Cromwell comes back from his campaigns in Ireland and Scotland and then closes the Rump Parliament in 1653, by which point the king has been executed, there is a vacuum of power, that he then assumes power and ceases Parliament to sit, and basically has dictatorial control over England, that he was betrayed and that he was a Machiavellian character all the time. And Carlyle is completely against this idea that Cromwell was Machiavellian. It's the complete opposite.
Yeah, it's interesting that Carlyle, someone we usually associate with like Calvinist ideas about like predisposition towards things, does put a lot of emphasis towards the spontaneity of Cromwell's actions. And he does put that, no man can see into the future, like especially his own future, past a certain point, he says. It's simply that you are sort of mistaking the actions of a person and the results with what you would usually assume with actions of that kind. He is simply putting forth, Carlyle, that Cromwell, because of his innate truthfulness and his sort of divine might, in a sense. I think he makes quote, divine right is like divine might. He's basically, Cromwell had it in him to go in and do his work in the time that he was in what he was responsible for. There's a quote, I believe, he says that the facts are as they are. I will do what I can to mitigate my portion. So in a sense, Carlyle is giving a more natural path towards what Cromwell ended up doing in the end. And his idea was definitely not that Cromwell had a predisposed idea of what he was going to do, where he was going to conquer, and that he was simply following a program. As I'm not sure if historians in your country,
well, no, I was looking up on this, and a lot of the historiography on this, I think, backs Carlyle up in this sense. There's nothing. The Machiavellian aspect that I read about was something that existed kind of immediately post-Restoration to help condemn Cromwell. Of course, Machiavelli had been basically seen as a petty villain since Shakespearean times, when he compares Richard III to, like, I can be the Machiavel. Machiavelli was not seen as like a pragmatic person who could see a solution, even though Machiavelli himself was not Machiavellian in the sense that the English thought of him in that time. But when historians, once the dust had settled somewhat, I think that view changed, and you got to see Carlyle was the beginning of this, that in the 19th century they began to romanticize Cromwell somewhat. And that by the end of the century, or at least the beginning of the Edwardian, that statue went up outside Parliament, in Parliament Square, of Cromwell. But I think, so it doesn't work. The Machiavellian aspect.
I think what he's saying, that Cromwell was, what kind of path Cromwell was on, was not some tyrant in a Machiavellian sense, as you would think of. He views people like Cromwell and Cromwell himself in the sense of someone with true ambition. He makes this point at close to the end of the essay, where he says that true ambition is not the idea that you're so special and you need to be in power, or that people should revere you. he precisely points out that that type of thinking only creates weak men who are just spending their lives in melancholy pity towards what the others should
You're
be,
also you're also too
reviewing towards.
narcissistic,
Yeah,
or you're too paranoid. You're too
yeah,
you cannot be obsessed with if your ambition is only to be worshipped,
yeah,
then you're actually at the beck and call of the worshippers. Whereas
yeah,
no, you need to emerge intrinsically, and Carlyle's obsessed with this ineffable character of Cromwell, that he seems to have this knack for military command. Just at the moment, he's had no training in it, and just at the moment when England needs a great military commander. And if that had been on the royalist side, then they may have won the Civil War. But the person who has all the knacks is on the parliamentarian side, and it's Cromwell. And then it's through that he gains this sort of mystique. I think the campaigns of Ireland and Scotland, and then he comes back to find that the parliament that had been set up in this Commonwealth is getting nothing done, and then he basically demands it to be closed. It's this great, it's so Carlylean that you can see exactly why he's obsessed with it. He grabs the scepter and says, like, basically, no, you lads are not sitting here anymore. You're a joke. I've been running these commands out on the edge of the kingdoms, and you guys are sitting here in the center doing nothing. Yeah,
he's basically a man who is interested in his faith and what he believes is true, as opposed to someone who is specifically interested in power. I believe reading his biography, it's also very, like, listening to his biography more likely, but listening to his biography, it's also very apparent that he also wanted the parliament to work in a sense. But when the parliament just proved to be beyond inept, he had to pick power by himself.
Providence makes it so that I need to save sort of England and make it Protestant. And if Parliament isn't going to do it, then I'll do it, sort of thing. It's not like I want to close Parliament because I want the power. It's that, he sees it being ineffectual first and then decides to take it. Is kind of like, you see this in a lot of forms of leadership, that they occupy a space because they can't believe others aren't occupying it, almost. And then they realize the fragility of the whole system they've inherited, and they go, if I do not take command of this, then the whole house of cards is going to collapse. You see that again in Joseph Chamberlain when he enters power. Like, how does someone so liberal as Chamberlain end up splitting from the Liberal Party and then forming with the Tories? It's because when he's in power, he sees how brittle everything is, and it turns him more rightward. It turns him towards needing to consolidate. You can't just be so liberal that the whole thing falls apart, sort of thing. Or you can't just be so commandeering towards Parliament.
He saved, Cromwell saved England from suicide. Which is interesting. Which is an interesting point. I'm not exactly sure on the historic side of things, but it is definitely interesting that Cromwell was not somebody who had power because he wanted power. Cromwell had power because he had the innate truth within him and was likely to act on that truth with might or with words. Whatever was necessary at the time. This is something that he mentioned in Muhammad as well, and this is a continuous theme within all of the essays we read so far. He does mention at the end that one fault of Cromwell was that he actually did disband the Parliament, something that he was criticizing Charles for doing. And it is interesting that Carlyle, since the first essay that we read, Carlyle, as you remember in the first essay, he said that a man's faults actually inform who he is just as much as his successes. And then we kind of criticized Carlyle for right after saying that, but let us leave the faults off to the side. And we kind of see this in this chapter as well. He does mention that, as all of his, efforts into making the parliament work, he still did disband it and took power as a king. And he doesn't really, I think,
he doesn't accept the kingship offer, which I think is critical. There was two parts to the Cromwell life that I saw in the wider Carlylean sense that interested me. We talked in the last one, why did he choose Luther and Knox when he said priest, because inherently when you think of priest, you think of a small parish, local priest, conservative figure who doesn't want to rustle feathers, just giving small, low-key morality advice to his flock, right? But the priest for Carlyle is the reformer, almost a revolutionary zeal. Muhammad as well ruffles the feathers of the people of the established order in Mecca. He's not someone who
he breaks the idols. His whole point
exactly
is to completely overturn the current religion.
Odin's kind of in such a mystified form we can't
Odin
even
is
tell.
kind of the beginning almost. He brings everything in, and he sort of kickstarts the civilization in the region that he is occupying. I mean,
it's still
but
what I was getting at was there's this element of revolutionarism to him. It's almost like Carlyle wants to set up a pantheon of heroes that are of revolutionary ilk, or today you would call it populist, because it's not leftwards, right? There's nothing Marxist. I know Carlyle's predating Marx when he's giving these lectures, but there's nothing Marxist about this. It's not oppressor versus oppressed. It's someone calling out false forms or forms that have decayed, which is how Carlyle always says it. And then you're left with the difficulty of, well, you call out the false forms, they've decayed, but then obviously what the form Cromwell created was short-lived, right? He couldn't create his own long-lasting formation. Basically the whole thing disintegrates upon his death.
Right after he died, like 2 years after, they just brought back
his son briefly comes in charge, but has none of the network, none of the reputation of having done anything. So and I think was also, in the Carlyle sense, a more weak-willed character.
That is interesting with sons of like big emperors that were very wise beyond their years, like Marcus Aurelius or with Cromwell, because Marcus Aurelius' son was possibly one of the worst emperors of all time, as opposed to his dad, who was all historical records show that he was actually a very tempered guy. I mean, I just found that interesting.
Well, I mentioned this when I was trying to come up with some Carlyle rules for revolution that I got once I finished volumes 1 and 2 of the French Revolution. It's a video on the channel. That the apple still falls is like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, but it still falls. Gravity is like this natural effect that on an apple, similar to how the generation has this effect of you will fall away unless somebody catches it, unless you're pushed up by agency and exertion, you will fall.
There's a great analogy about gravity in this very chapter as well. The bricklayer, as Carlyle puts it, if you have a bricklayer and he doesn't pay attention or actually try to, with all of his energies, try to make a sound structure, then the gravity will simply fall to ruin on top of him. It's kind of this idea that, if you don't
it's very similar to the idea I was just discussing.
Yeah, exactly. He makes this analogy in this chapter that, if you don't have a leader and you're just laying bricks without any kind of an idea what you're doing, like as if you didn't have an architect and you just thought you could make a house by laying bricks on top of one another, then gravity will make that structure fall on top of you, therefore bringing everything to ruin and chaos. And in a sense, the hero is the guy who can lay the bricks with assurance, and someone who knows how the structure itself is situated. Someone who is in communication with the truth, as Carlyle puts it again and again. But
it's that idea of the truth that begins to jar, because there's people now I happen to agree with Carlyle on most times when he says, like, I roughly do agree that the Catholic Church in the early 16th century was ripe for, it had become a form which had become sort of decayed, or it was a semblance of things. And there was even a quote in this on Cromwell where it's like, you worship every day He was a man who worships God every day, not just on Sunday. That's like what he means of this idea of you live your life by absolute devoutness. You're not just leaving yourself to the semblance of things. You're not just going to mass on Sunday because everyone else goes to mass on Sunday. Because you do this practice and that's what Catholicism had become this great charade or facade that everyone was doing, but there was no honest heart and belief in it. Luther brings that in. Now that's fine, but there are those who would say the form had not decayed. There were still devout people in the clergy. There were, not every single person of the cardinalship was completely corrupt or without the belief in the Catholic form. So it is difficult to say, like, well, was Luther right to go against these people who still, Carlyle will favor the outsider who wants to tumble it down a little bit. And then once if he tumbles it down in the right Carlylean manner, which is with this kind of zest and absolute energy, then Carlyle will kind of go, "Oh yeah, you've got the truth. The other guy was kind of old stale." Whereas he seems to hate that sort of the more traditional conservative who wants to keep what he inherits. He will favor those who want to tear down something, but he will want them to create something new, proper in its place. That's why he loves the Napoleon. That's why he loves the Cromwell, because they didn't just tear down. Cromwell is able to erect the protectorship and also erect something slightly new, but kind of the same. This is what Carlyle's obsessed with. Napoleon doesn't become king again, even though his hero is king, right? Hero is king. That's kingship in the sense that you will be listened to as a king. As Carlyle always says, König.
That's not kingship in that, you're born as a king.
Man that can or does, yeah. And even in the French Revolution, he says Mirabeau briefly becomes king in this sense, as does Danton before Napoleon. These are like mini Napoleons, but they can't last long enough. But you don't actually inherit the same thing. And there's this line that Cromwell had when offered the kingship, which said, eventually declines it. He says, "I would not seek to set up that which Providence hath destroyed and laid in the dust, and I would not build up Jericho again," which is this idea of God had destroyed the walls of Jericho. So it doesn't mean never build a wall again, but it means don't build the same wall again. So Carlyle really likes these themes. I mean, that line by Cromwell is a line Carlyle himself could have easily said.
Yeah, I want to echo your line about Carlyle not being a traditional conservative. And I actually did get this not progressive. I wouldn't really point it out as progressive. It depends on what your definition of progressive is. But I did get this notion that Carlyle does not fit into this mold of tradition, in the sense that we need to revere heroes just like people revered heroes before. And then we need to revere heroes of the past as opposed to heroes of the present, and so forth. Carlyle does give is a liberal in a sense when it comes to adapting to new times, as opposed to when he is talking about a hero from the past. He is always trying to bring it up to date. And this is something I noticed with Carlyle, because I have, in the last few weeks, when we were going through Carlyle, and especially when we're going through Carlyle as opposed to Emerson, just like in Shakespeare, I have been very critical of Carlyle's thinking over and over again. And I thought, like, I saw these strands of traditional conservatism in the way he talks about the sort of innate talents, and the way he sort of seemed to be, in my opinion, bringing down the value of Shakespeare's struggles by stating that Shakespeare was just this awesome light fountain that was very bright from the very beginning, as if he didn't have any kind of period where
he downplayed his sort of business acumen.
Obviously. He downplayed it quite a bit and had that terrible quote about not Shakespeare's art not being artifice, which I found extremely pretentious. I did find that pretty pretentious.
Still rankling, I see.
But I actually noticed something while reading this chapter. I didn't read this chapter by simply opening my book and going through paragraph by paragraph. I actually listened to your wonderful audiobook. If you don't know, John has a great audiobook of all of the essays that we are discussing here on his channel.
Yeah, I think I'll go back and add them below in each one of them, the corresponding ones.
Yeah, I think that will be very helpful. But what I noticed from listening to the essay as opposed to reading it was that I didn't stop at like 2 sentences forward to say like, oh, what the hell is this about? Let me take notes about how much I disagree with this. Like, I got the whole, I get to experience the whole chapter without cutting down any of Carlyle's rants or Carlyle's like these mini statements that he makes. And I actually found that I got a different response from myself about the chapter than I would if I were just reading the chapter passage by
I'm very
passage
glad you got that, because
hand.
that's exactly why I wanted to upload it in the first place. Was when I was reading it. They're called lectures, and when I was reading it, I was like, this is an oration. You reading it, but you're like, this should be a narration.
Emotion into it as well while you're reading it, which is very helpful, especially if you have in your own voice read the passages that contradict you. We have this knack of when we're reading a passage that contradicts our own thoughts, we read it with a sort of annoying voice in our heads. So we actually bring down the text while we're reading it. But while I was listening to it through your narration, I've actually noticed quite a lot that, Carlyle definitely does not fit into a traditional conservative mold, because he's not very concerned with conserving anything, in a sense. He's mostly concerned with basically this idea of hero worship as it leads to spontaneous action, as it relates to Cromwell. He actually starts this essay, Hero as King, as saying the king is sort of it's not the primitive version of the hero, just like he said about the god, but the king is sort of what you would call this, not the simplest mold, but I would say like a preliminary mold that all other heroism sort of sprung forth. I believe I took that quote right there. Let me just, because I think it was one of the first ones that okay, king, the king, in his opinion, might as well the summary of all other types of heroisms, because that's where everything comes. That's the type of thought process that you need in order to be a hero in any field. I believe he called Shakespeare the real king of England, or something of that sort, while we were reading it, because I did made fun of that whole rant about the whole if you were to ask England for its Shakespeare or the India, England would give India away because the Shakespeare is the real king of England. But he does make that distinction as someone being the king of something when he is describing heroism. So in that sense, Carlyle doesn't think like you need to fit into a mold, respect tradition always, even if they tend towards falsehoods, and just live your life in the most compatible way possible to the time you're living in. Carlyle actually believes that through the process of heroes, he does make the point that heroes need their times. I believe I can get that quote right here. Just a second. He does make the point that the hero needs the people as well, because he's saying that.
I was going to allude to this. You can try to find it. I was going to allude to it when the other part of Cromwell was that he comes into the fore with these armies. Yeah, I'll just finish my thought. We'll go back to
Yeah, go ahead.
He comes into the fore with these armies, and he kicks out the Earl of Manchester, the parliamentarian, because he seemed to be, he basically usurps him slowly over time because Cromwell has the popular support, and he's able to model the new army on the basis of this support that he has from the ground up, which is this natural becoming of king. That the Earl of Manchester, the Earl of Manchester could have been the new king-like figure, replacing the old corrupt edifice of Charles, again in Carlyle's eyes, the corrupt edifice of Charles. But it couldn't have been because he was not with the people. The people need to support the leader in an almost natural way. Again, it's this quality which you just have to possess. Call it charisma, call it what you will. And there is this line. If you give your line, and then I'll give mine.
Not only a hero is needed, but a world fit for him. Heroes can seem mean to the world, just like how Cromwell is seen, but they are first and foremost a hero to themselves, not the people around them. So he does make this on another quote. He does state that a hero with its people without its hero cannot do anything, whereas a hero without its people can still do something. That is an interesting way of looking at it. And in the broadest sense, Carlyle has this idea of the people being in relation with heroes as the recipe for moving civilization forward from whatever swamp that it has fallen into, as opposed to whatever the times that it's in, with all of its injustices and
that's why he spends
corruption.
So much time giving Cromwell standing atop this oak tree as a kid, looking over the literal marshes of the fens, because it's this great symbology of what's about to occur. I have the quote here of when Cromwell was getting accused of basically having too many non-nobles in his army, right? Men of poor rank. It says, "If you choose godly, honest men to be captains of horse, honest men will follow them. I would rather have a plain russet-coated captain who knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else." Again, that's so Carlyle, but it's a Cromwellian quote. And it's very similar to what we're going to get with Napoleon later, with this levée en masse, or this great appeal to the mass people to participate in his event, his reforging. And again, we talked about this idea that the power of right becomes the power of might in Carlyle's sense, that this helps the power of might genuinely. In the French Revolution, the Girondins collapsed to the Jacobins in around 1793 because the Girondins want to follow the formula. They want to follow this idea that we can make the Constitution march with this formulaic idea of everyone's represented and here's all the functions. Whereas the Jacobins have a groundswell at that time, which is basically all their little societies, the Mother Society, and they have all these clubs scattered around the country. They can get this groundswell, and they're basically kind of thuggish as well. Like they just force their way. They force people to get their way out of obstinacy, out of thuggishness, out of sort of intimidation tactics. And again, on top of all that, they're not doing it because they have this formula that they think can work. They've got effectively a religious zeal of what sort of political body they want to institute. But then all of that, it again kind of disintegrates because it's so unwieldy, right? So Jacobinism is not the final form. Napoleon is the final form. So it's similar here with Cromwell, that other parliamentarians had other ideas, but it's not the final form. Which I thought was great. Like that groundswell is coupled with that, the might, because if you're a military man as well in those times, it's interesting to know what you make of this now. You can't kind of do that in the same sense. Well, you could. You still see coups are happening, in Burma and whatever at the moment, but it's much less likely a military commander can come back into a body politic like that in the same manner.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, there was a coup here 5 years ago, and all the guys involved in the coup are very much not in politics anymore.
I might go into that. There's a lot of theories.
If you were to
about
go
that
into
too.
that, I think you would be here the entire time. So let me just return to what you said about the russet-colored uniforms that the men are wearing, and that the idea that they didn't have what you would call a pre-made program to follow. They were more spontaneous. It is interesting when you assume what Cromwell was going up against with King Charles II and basically the noble body of
You have this image
the
of Charles.
Parliament.
Do you want to flesh that out? Is it
Yeah.
this image of what Charles was
So
around
King
1640?
Charles.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, when I was going into this, I actually had to research Cromwell a little bit. But what I found was that I actually know of King Charles I before I even had to research Cromwell, because I read quite a bit of books on art history, and King Charles I, I believe, right? Or the second. I'm not sure about which King Charles it is, but King Charles himself, the first. King Charles I is actually a very prominent figure in art history because of how much of a patron of the arts he was. He was basically one of the biggest patron of the arts in the entire history of art. Many of the prominent painters went past this court, including Gian Lorenzo Bernini, Anthony van Dyck, Peter Paul Rubens, Artemisia Gentileschi. I mean, essentially, just think about it. Every single prominent artist of the time almost have made works for King Charles I. You know, just imagining, this guy was broke most of his career. He had to always push Parliament to give him more money through taxing the people. So the way he is such a big patron of the arts, as opposed to what his actual monetary situation is, really showcases what kind of a person King Charles I is. You know, I mean, just looking at the paintings, I just opened this book to like peruse it, and there's quite a lot of paintings just featuring the color blue, for instance. The color blue at the time was more valuable than gold. And sorry, did I go away for a second?
Yeah, I was trying to get you to see the whole screen if you want to share a picture. Is it?
Okay. Well, let me just open.
Yeah, you got solo layout.
Yeah, a lot of the paintings have lost color. So basically, but like you can see a lot of blue within the paintings that are mentioned, and obviously there are a lot of paintings of the king himself, where he is standing against the blue background. But this guy essentially was, another known fact about him, something I learned when I was reading the biography of Artemisia Gentileschi, basically the first female artist superstar that you can think of, because she was one of the most like well-paid artists of the time, one of the first female artists to be as well-paid, and was basically working on big canvases. But you know, he would have these different artists, such as Van Dyck, the most expensive artist of the time. Peter Paul Rubens, for a time, he wasn't a stay-in, for instance. And Artemisia Gentileschi's dad, who was also a painter. He had these people and like leagues of other painters as well that I can't name because I don't know them well. But he had these big, expensive painters live in his estate and create paint all sorts of different paintings for him. And there's a very interesting event in his life where he wanted a bust of him made by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the most prominent sculptor of the time. There's a great documentary of him by Simon Schama, if you're interested. But basically, he wanted Gian Lorenzo Bernini to make a sculpture for him, but Gian Lorenzo Bernini couldn't leave Rome with all his materials. So what he did was he had Van Dyck make 3 different portraits of himself, one from the front, one from a little side, and one from the profile. and just sent that to John Lorenzo Bernini to work in. And this is something I cannot see. I cannot tell when if this was an unprecedented thing to be done, but this just shows how much, basically, how much of his money went into the arts, because he basically had this whole notion of taking 3 pictures and making it into a 3D model is something that's done in AAA game studios right nowadays, and he did this in the 17th century. This guy basically had the biggest AAA game studio making him the best AAA games for only his enjoyment out of other people's pockets. Just imagine if you, for instance, paid $60 for a game for Boris Johnson to play only.
He's just there on his own with a solo console.
That's kind of who King Charles I was.
Leave me alone, Rishi Sunak. I'm playing my video games.
I mean, obviously other kings also had their pictures made, but this guy like pushed it levels beyond what other people did while he was broke. I mean, this just shows what Cromwell was going up against with, as opposed to like the type of person.
You know what it reminds me of, though? We have this whole we had this whole concept of the wall, the bricklayer, and you need gravity. You need the agency to keep the wall up. Charles, with all this enterprise, is so obsessed with aesthetic. Now, aesthetic can be this idea of you want the true good and beautiful, as Scruton says. So the beautiful is important, but the wall needs to stand up. And it reminds me of something like he's spending all this money on this. It's like adding all this detail, these grand Corinthian column style to the top of your facade, or the most ornate Baroque design on top of this wall, which is crumbling on the inside, which is just about to collapse. So your aesthetic beauty means nothing if the form of what it's on top of is going to fall apart. And it doesn't mean nothing, right? You'd rather look at a nice looking piece of architecture than a bad one, but it needs to stand up. And that's what Charles was doing with this. Like, the body politic was disintegrating, and he was employing all these so he could be seen to be like this grand master of the arts for all of Europe to look at him. And what does it mean in the end? It means the stuff as a second layer, but his base is rotten, and that's why Carlyle will say, "Oh, give me the raw base." I mean, Cromwell was no artist. Cromwell abhorred. He cancelled Christmas? All the usual.
I think many of the artists either got killed in the struggle or had to
banned the stage. That was it. Like, for all of Carlyle's worship of Cromwell, he also worshipped Shakespeare, but the two are at complete odds with each other in its own way. Yeah. Now, again, I think if you read into the way those stage performances had become by the 1630s, a lot of them were quite debauched and stuff. You can see why, from a moral standpoint, Cromwell was rejecting this. But again, it's the extreme measure, and we see that extreme measure come forward again and again with Cromwell. I come from Ireland, and we're forced to despise Cromwell. He has this campaign in Ireland in 1649-50, the back end of the civil wars, where Charles is gone, but there's still some royalist outposts in Scotland and Ireland, and they team up with this Irish Catholic convention. Cromwell comes in and annihilates them, particularly on the east coast of Ireland. There's a massacre, particularly I think in Drogheda, where he basically butchers anyone on the other side. And there's this quote of him being like, it is kind of like that religious zeal where it's going, I'm killing these so that there'll be less bloodshed in the future. He's justifying it to himself that these people have basically prolonged this civil war, which I've already finished. So I'm just going to go in and clean it out. So there's that idea of zero tolerance. That's the thing. He doesn't say, okay, well, let's keep some stage and let's try and gone. He was the same in his military stance. It was just complete and utter disregard for the middle ground in its own way, which is quite different to a Shakespeare. A Shakespeare is fleshing all these different characters from all these different points of view. So it's interesting that Carlyle gives reverence to both.
The massacre, though, right? because I didn't
Oh,
catch
no, he
it.
glosses
And
over all of that. That's not the
yeah,
tone that he goes for on his Cromwell essay at all.
yeah,
Yeah.
I did listen to that when I was listening to Cromwell's biography, that he was just this ruthless guy is in that one battle especially, but I didn't hear at all Carlyle mention it. It's just another one of that dual thought of Carlyle that we thought of in the very first chapter about, the mistakes of the man are important, but let's just gloss over it. And that's basically how he has dealt with it so far. So he was definitely not being untruthful there. He was actually being very sincere, which is, as you know, Carlyle's one rule for how things should function. If you are sincere, according to Carlyle, then if you're a hero, you will have the position of the hero. If you are sincere and everybody else is sincere, and if you're a hero, then you will have the position of hero, even though you didn't aim for power or any kind of system where you get to decide everything. And according to Carlyle, if you're not a hero, then you will be a royal follower who is also sincere, and you will have faith as it relates to the actual truth.
We've reached the 50-minute mark, but that's a good point to say, like, this idea of sincerity, because we're going to next time go into this fifth lecture on the hero as man of letters. Now, Carlyle gives most of that time to Johnson, but there's going to be some time given to Voltaire. We'll try flesh out the Voltaire position. A man who was perhaps seen as less sincere. We know Carlyle is not very forthcoming with praise for Voltaire. So, is there anything at this point where this is our first exposure to Carlyle's idea of how a king can come in, even if they're not officially titled as such? They are a king by nature. Is there anything else you have on that before we're going to touch back on similar themes with Napoleon? So I just wondered, where are you with Carlyle's idea of this king coming in general at this point?
Do you mean as an endpoint for discussing the king at this time? Until we discuss the king in the next episode, which is like
just wondering where you are. Are you with Carlyle?
Yeah,
are you along the ride with him?
Yeah, I am along the ride with Carlyle on this issue, because I have found that the way of looking at Carlyle I've described, I can actually see the less conservative aspect of Carlyle, and I can actually revere that to an extent. And I love this way I don't think this is how he ends the essay, but this is one of the paragraphs that ends Cromwell's section. And I love this way of him characterizes Cromwell's, both the place where he comes from and the place where he ends up being left, which is this hated figure in many parts of England, in a sense. And I want to read this one paragraph about how Cromwell's place in history, which I quite love. He says, "His dead body was hung in chains. His place in history. Place in history, forsooth, has been a place of ignominy, accusation, blackness, and disgrace. And here, this day, who knows if it is not rash in me to be among the first that ever ventured to pronounce him not a knave and liar, but a genuinely honest man. Peace to him. Did he not, in spite of all, accomplish much for us? We walk smoothly over his great, rough, heroic life, step over his body sunk in the ditch there. We need not spurn it as we step on it. Let the hero rest. It was not to men's judgment that he appealed, nor have men judged him very well." So it's definitely not a conservative, like if this person is a classic hero, then we need to take him as a classic hero, and if it's a classic villain, we need to take him as a classic villain, because that's what has worked so far. Carlyle definitely goes beyond that. So that makes sense to me as to why the transcendentalist, and obviously Emerson's more progressive bent, has found Carlyle a fascinating figure, because once you move forward your minor sort of grievances to his sort of Calvinist thinking methods, Carlyle actually does seem to be someone who is constantly looking towards the future and looking towards innovations in the sense of how we experience the world with our heroes or as someone who reveres them. So yeah, that's how I would like to end
Cool.
my thoughts
Yeah.
on Hero as King. You have any
We'll
final thoughts?
close our Cromwellian chapter on that. Yeah, Carlyle wanted this idea of Cromwell having this Cromwelliad that the poets could sing of. So hopefully we've added something to the Cromwelliad there during our discussion. And next time, as we said, it's going to be heroes as man of letters. So Voltaire, maybe some Rousseau, and Dr. Johnson. I think he has some on Burns as well. We'll see how much we go into Burns. But until then, guys, see you.